Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I recently moved out of a nightmare apartment. We had a house built on the opposite side of town on old farmland. I thought I had done everything right, even had a priest come and bless the house. It has been about 6 months since we moved in, but it seems like everywhere we go something keeps happening. We have literally moved 4 times in 4 years to locations in 3 different states. I will highlight a few of the incidents. This one I am really not sure what it even is, but I have seen it 3 times now. It started one night when I first saw this gold light fill the hallway outside my bedroom. I tried to write it off as a trick of the eye or maybe a passing car. A few weeks later, I was sitting in the living room and all of a sudden then a bright golden, almost sparkler-like ball of pure golden light was flying about. It was flying around my daughter's room and then disappeared down the hallway. The last time I saw it was the exact same appearance, still flying around my daughter's room, but this time being followed or chased by a pitch-black ball. It looked like it was trying to flee from whatever was chasing it. So I kept this to myself because I didn't want to startle my wife since it's a new house. But one day she was telling me about how she was taking the kids to school. In front of the car was a ball of light that looked the same as I described floating down the road. The next strange occurrence only happened once, but still startled me. I had some weird feeling one night and woke up to see a girl with long dark hair and a white-looking nightgown standing next to my bed staring at my wife. It moved toward my wife and I blinked, it was gone. I am a very light sleeper and any noise in my house will wake me up. On one particular night I was woken up by what I thought was my daughter screaming. I thought maybe she was having a nightmare, so I get up from bed only to see something that still bothers me to this day. Standing in my laundry room was a man in a gray suit. The top of his head was above the doorpost, and he had the most disturbing, creepy grin. It was almost a comical-looking smile that went up his face. As soon as I saw him, he began to dissipate, almost as if he was in water. As he was fading away, I had an intrusive thought enter my head. This idea or thought entered my mind telling me I was not meant to see him, it wasn't for me. Even now I feel as if someone is watching us, just lurking in the shadows. The next morning I told my wife about what happened. To my surprise, she responded,
"You finally saw him too."
She begins to tell me how she keeps seeing the same grinning man. She tells me that she has seen him in the neighbor's yard along the tree line, just standing there watching. When she looked at the side mirror to double check what she saw, the mirror was blacked out almost like a void. It's happened about 6 times now, in different places. She also gets these intrusive thoughts, but each time it's the same.
I was waiting for you. I am watching.
The more I try to think about it and try to remember the details of it, I get a migraine. There are other small things that happen, but not really noteworthy. Every so often I will see what looks like a shadow peeking around the corner or moving quickly around the room. I just wish I knew why these things keep happening.
It was the summer of 1986, and I had just graduated from high school. I was living in Vancouver, British Columbia, and a girlfriend and I spent the afternoon at Kitsilano Beach, suntanning. She had to leave early for work, so I stayed on the beach alone. It was around 4 p.m., and I was hungry. I walked up the beach over to an area called Spanish Banks. There is a concession stand there. It had a long lineup. It was Expo 86, so we had a ton of tourists that summer, and the beach was packed. I placed my order, but was told that it would be a 15 or 20-minute wait for my food. I perched myself on a bench and proceeded to wait. For some reason, I looked across the street. The concession stand is adjacent to the road, a narrow 2-lane road, not the best for beach traffic, and the other side of the road is forest called the University of British Columbia Endowment Lands, attached to the university. There was a guy walking down through the forest, which was also a steep hill. There is no sidewalk below, and it was a really dangerous place to try to cross the street. Not only that, it was an odd place to come out of. Imagine a steep hill with lots of bushes and trees going straight down to a curb, and then a busy street. The second that I saw this guy and I was far away at the concession stand, I had that gut-wrenching fear that everyone describes when encountering something bizarre. Even though he was far away, I could tell that he was grinning maliciously and that he was fixated on me. He crossed the street, grinning. At that moment, there were no cars, so he got across easily. He made a beeline straight to where I was and went and sat on a bench across from me. I am not good at distances, but let's say 10 or 15 feet away. He was First Nations. A little bit older than I was, maybe 19 or 20. He had medium-length hair and was wearing a white t-shirt and a red flannel shirt over it, unbuttoned. He was wearing jeans. I can't remember his shoes, runners of some kind. He was fairly attractive, but utterly evil. Malicious was the word that kept going through my mind. Now, his eyes. They were black. No whites could be seen. But they were not shiny. His were dull. The way that I described it to my boyfriend later was that they looked like scratched black plastic. They also gave me that feeling of when you look into a microscope or binoculars and you can kind of see your own eyelashes squished against the lens, and it's almost spider-like. His eyes, and his everything frightened me like nothing else ever has. He sat there grinning at me. He knew that I was terrified, and I knew that I had to pretend that I wasn't. I felt totally alone, even though there were tons of people around. No one else seemed to notice anything amiss. I felt as though knowing that this person existed made me hate being alive. This world would never be safe if things like him existed. I sat there acting totally normal on the outside, trying to keep it together because it seemed instrumental to my survival. I had no idea what this thing would do, but I felt as if my life was in danger. My food was ready for pickup. I got it, and then proceeded to go over to a payphone, and I kept my back to him and phoned my boyfriend. I told him to get over to Spanish Banks because there was a really scary guy here and I didn't know how to get away. After my boyfriend hung up, I stayed in the phone booth, pretending to talk to someone. At some point, I had to get off, maybe someone wanted the phone. I then sat back on my bench, and he stayed, grinning. A minute or two before my boyfriend got there, he got up and sauntered away, down the beach. When my boyfriend got there, he wanted to go after him. I grabbed his arm hard and told him that we had to get out of there now. I could not explain properly to my boyfriend just how terrifying that experience was. I still can never explain it properly. It was scarier than a murderer. It felt as though if this thing could do something to you, it wouldn't just end your life. It would do something that would destroy or torment your soul forever.
This happened back in '92. I only told a few people about this and they look at me like I'm crazy. I had a regular place I would stop and pick up pop or, soda or water, whatever. I went to the cooler, got some water, walked and got in line. Got in line behind this guy and I never smelled anything so much like a gutted deer. I'm a hunter, it didn't compare to this. It was close, but it didn't compare to this. If you got a kid or whatever, when the kid is really sick you can feel the fever coming off of him. That is what I felt. And I was like, surely the guy knows that other people can smell this. I looked and there were 3 or 4 other people in line behind me and they were all nonchalant, fiddling with their purchases or whatever they were doing. I looked at the guy behind the counter. I looked at him and he looked like nothing was going on. The guy in front of me stepped up. He got a pack of cigarettes. They were Marlboros in the box, I remember that. He got a pack and I'm almost gagging. Okay. Like I said, I gutted a deer before and it didn't. It's close but doesn't quite smell the same and the heat was like you were standing in front of one of those heat lamps at Burger King or something. And I'm thinking I'm sure everyone can smell this. Right then he turned. I'm facing the counter. I guess you'd call it quartering. His right shoulder was kind of lined up with my left and I'm standing about 2 feet behind him. I'm 6'1", so he was probably 6'4". And as he turned, have you ever had a joke, like a private joke between you and a friend, you give each other that look? He did that out of the corner of his eye. He kind of just sort of turned his head, cocked his lips, and he was looking at me out of the corner of his eye like he was smiling at me. And, I didn't tell your screener this, but it looked like his mouth didn't fit his teeth. Now they weren't pointy or jagged, but it was like the skin was stretched. He turned, kind of sorta cocked his head at me and gave me this sort of weird, half-lit grin and walked away. It scared me. To this day, this was '92. I even had nightmares about it. I never smelled anything like that. As I got closer to it, the heat was like an infection. And I looked at the lady behind me and she was messing with whatever she had in her hand, and I thought I knew she would wince, but I don't know, it was the most bizarre thing. To this day I still think about that. He was wearing Levis, a pair of cowboy boots, a black braided leather belt, a nice Oxford shirt that was tucked in, and he had really short hair for '92, I remember that.
This happened about 25 years ago. It happened only once, meaning it hasn't followed me around like some people report. I was driving in Torrington, Connecticut. While driving up a kind of crummy industrial street, I looked forward to seeing how the street was twisting. While about 100 yards ahead of me, on the driver's side sidewalk, I saw a figure. I could tell he or she was 1, dark, 2, tall, 3, waking very fast as if in a hurry to get somewhere. Now, my wife was in the car also. So I kept my eyes on it. As I approached him or her, perhaps within 30 yards, he suddenly whipped around looking straight at me. Now I saw the entire figure, dressed all in black, big floppy black leather hat, big floppy black cape, black suit, except for a white shirt with perhaps a red string tie, black pointy boots or shoes. He was very tall, over 6'6" and extremely thin. His face, well, it was very long and thin also. He had a jutting jaw, huge dark eyes, heavy brow, and his most prominent feature, an absolutely incredibly long nose. I mean stunningly so. He was grinning, but not a friendly or cocky grin. It was a menacing, mean grin, a grin that someone would use when they were saying, "I got you," or something hideous like that, and he kept looking at me as I drove past him. Just me, not the car, not my wife, nothing but me, or so it felt. As I drove past him I looked in the rearview mirror. He kept his eyes on me. His grin was wider, and perhaps he was laughing, I've forgotten. I kept driving until he was out of sight. My wife saw him. She confirmed what I saw. Nowadays, though, she isn't so sure. Was this thing perhaps the Hatman? I've read up on this, and while some things match, others don't. His features were clear, not shadowy, but I was filled with dread, even though it was daytime and there was nothing really to get freaked out about. I don't really shake easily, but he got burned into my head and he's been there for 25 years. I've never seen him again. He didn't follow me, and thank God. I couldn't handle that, but there was something sinister about him. Usually when I see a weirdo, I may feel sorry for him or her, but this wasn't the case. I was scared, plain and simple. I thought that this was my first and only time seeing this character. I even began feeling guilty that I thought this poor soul may have been evil. But now, 25 years later, I had a second encounter with this thing. This time under much more puzzling circumstances. I was driving home from work, the road damp from a slight drizzle that had stuck around all day. Usually I'm a fast driver, always driving the max speed allowed by Connecticut law. I'm not used to being passed by other vehicles, but looking in my side mirror, I could tell that a car was about to pass me with ease. As he pulled even with me, the car slowed down in order to match my speed and stare into my car. At first I thought it was a friend who recognized my vehicle. Looking into the car, I saw a man driving, all decked out in a big Three Musketeers type hat. I thought he was simply a weird dude until he turned to meet my stare, and it all came rushing back. This was the same guy, or looked like the dude I saw 25 years ago. Same gigantic nose, cheesy mustache and goatee. Same huge chin. And then he smiled. It all came flooding back, that terrifying, taunting, evil teeth-filled grin. It sent shivers up my spine. Then something really weird happened. Throwing his head back in what I saw as a terrifying laugh, he sped up and pulled ahead of me in the left lane. Then I experienced something I cannot explain. When he was about 20 yards ahead of me, he suddenly took a right-hand turn at 70 miles per hour. He didn't pull into my lane, he just made a 90-degree turn, as one would do when turning the corner of a street. I missed his rear quarter panel by mere inches. When I looked in the rear-view mirror, I expected to see him spin out of control or smash into another vehicle, but I simply saw him traveling across the highway, heading at high speeds towards the wall lining the freeway. Not a chance he could avoid it. He was hustling towards a sure fatal crash with the wall when he simply disappeared. There was no crashing sound, no nothing. He was gone. Needless to say, I was shocked. How could a car doing 70 make a 90-degree turn? How did he just disappear? How could I have been the only other car on a busy highway during rush hour? And why 25 years later? Hatman? Weirdo? This episode is much harder to explain than the initial meeting. That's my story. This thing is a creep. Seems to enjoy scaring the shit out of me. Oh, and to make things even weirder, my wife now swears she remembers no such being ever crossing paths with us.
In early April of 2017, I required a CAT scan at a local hospital here in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm sitting in the waiting area with a couple of other people. Each person was called and taken in by a woman. I was the last one left, waiting for an unreasonably long time, so I kept looking for anyone to call me for my scan. After a while, I became restless, so I got up and looked in the CAT scan hallway, but nobody seemed to be there. I walked over to another area with a reception desk, but no one was there either. I thought they must all be on a lunch break and I was not happy. So I went back to my seat. A few minutes later, the CAT scan hallway door opens and I'm expecting to see that same woman asking me to come in, but this time a man came out. The only words that I can write to describe him are that he was bizarre and downright hideous looking, exceptionally tall and thin. He had on a strange-looking suit and tie. His eyes were just slits, his skin was scarred, and he was completely bald. My initial thought was there is no way that this guy works here. He looked so horrid. He would simply scare children and half the people that needed scans. He also had the most insidious wide grin. I really wasn't scared, but completely perplexed why this guy would be allowed to work in this environment. He called out my first name and took great pains in pronouncing it. I followed him in and sat on the scan table. He went around the corner, but kept looking at me through the window. Then he was gone. I waited for several more minutes, until 2 other men came in to do my scan. I don't know why, but I didn't ask about the weird-looking man. In fact, I actually forgot about him. That was until I was at a friend's home a few weeks later and her sister dropped in for a visit. She mentioned that she worked at the same hospital in the radiology department. So I asked her who the bizarre man that works there was. She gave me a bewildered look and told me that she had no idea what I was talking about. She asked me to detail his appearance to her. She again confirmed that no one with that description worked there and became somewhat hostile at my insistence at what I saw. A week later, I went to my doctor for the results. His words were,
"I'm sorry, this is quite unusual. Your CAT scan is missing. The scan and report vanished and couldn't be found."
Now I wonder if the weird grinning man was responsible.
This encounter has been on my mind for some time and I'm looking for some answers or information. I just didn't know where to post and who to ask for help. I was 16 when this happened. Me and my older cousin, he was 19 at the time, were coming back from a family party, so our spirits were high even though it was 2 in the morning. On our route home there is a very long road that is quite wide. On both sides there are tall trees, not something you'd call a forest, but dense enough it creates darkness on each side. However, on the left side there is a thin strip of sidewalk, and on the right the sidewalk is wider, so wide you could probably drive down it. We were just having a heart-to-heart talking about various things like traveling, our family, generally what we want our future to be like. We weren't driving fast at all because we didn't really want to go home. I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Not knowing what it was, I turned to look out my window, but I couldn't see anything. In my gut I felt something was off and a wave of sadness came over me for no specific reason. I just felt like crying. I was about to ask my cousin if he was all right, but when I looked up I saw a figure running from the left side of the sidewalk to the right. It scared me so much because I've never seen anything like this before. It looked almost like a human, but I knew it couldn't be as it was extremely tall and so skinny, and its arms were long and looked to be thin. My cousin slammed on the brakes and I knew that what I just saw he saw too. Wanting to know what it was, I looked to the right side and I was utterly confused. A man on the right sidewalk was sitting there next to his bike. He looked at us and smiled. He was wearing cycling gear and his bike was on the ground. I was shocked and confused. Why would he be cycling at 2 in the morning? I crawled over the console and leaned over my cousin so my face was right up to the window. I stared at the man as he smiled back at me, but his smile had changed. It was so wide and toothy, he looked kinda normal but so out of place. As I examined him more, I noticed he only had one ear, and where it should be was totally flat, but everything else was just what you'd expect a human to look like. The man stood up and my cousin pulled me away from the window and back into my seat. He drove off so fast I didn't even have time to look through the mirrors to look back at the man. I tried to talk to my cousin about it that night and various other times, but he just snapped at me, telling me to drop the topic and never to bring it up around him again. I know what I saw, but at the same time I have no clue what it is.
Once in Arizona, a man walked into a hotel where I worked. He had a coat on, a pea green military-type coat and butcher paper. Yes, he had butcher paper around himself like some kind of tube top. Under his coat like a shirt. Further, one of his legs was giant, like twice the size of the other. He asked to use the pay phone in the lobby. I told him, sure, not yet realizing how weird he looked. He was kind of obscured by the desk and the entry door. We started out with a weird vibe the moment he actually crossed the lobby to the phone. When we finally got a good look at him, he walked a bit slow, but this made sense as his leg looked swollen. He then made a call and turned slightly to keep me and my coworker in his vision, staring sort of out of his peripheral vision. Very soon we could tell he wasn't listening to anyone and the phone was making noises like it was off the hook. I decided that was enough and demanded he leave, which he did abruptly by our side door. Now the really weird part, my coworker took a picture of him on that payphone with an old flip phone. In the digital pixelation he was moving or something which made him kinda blurrier than the rest of the picture, and he looked like his face was an oversized grinning skull. Black-eyed and whole where his nose should be. I still have that picture, it still creeps me out. It reminds me of the story about the man made of parts in the mirrored sunglasses. A story from Victoria, England, in which a man encountered a man he thought was made of parts.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.